Weary of the East after his check at Acre, and perceiving there was a better part for him to play in Europe, Napoleon seemed on his arrival in Paris from Egypt to possess all the qualities of the strong man who had been wanted since 1792 to bring back both order and security to the country and discipline and subordination in the government. He possessed these qualities in a greater degree than any of the other men who had attempted, either of their own accord or at the suggestions of their supporters, to play the dictator, than Lafayette or Dumouriez or Pichegru or Hoche or Augereau or Bernadotte or Joubert or Jourdan. He came flushed with triumph and surrounded with the glamour of victory. But however much he dazzled the nation and the army, he would have influenced the members of the councils but little, had it not been for Joseph and Lucien, who, without any thought for his return, had skillfully plotted to weaken the monstrous tyranny of the legislative and to strengthen the executive, which they were desirous of controlling. For public disinterestedness was here, as always, secondary to the advantage of the individual. Joseph was ready, in the absence of his brother Napoleon, who was abroad, to have come to an understanding with his brother-in-law Bernadotte, who was at hand. Between 1796 and 1799, Napoleon rose high in the estimation of the nation and the army. In Italy and Egypt, he had given proof of his capability as an organizer and enforcer of peace, and as an arbitrator, he was by nature so well fitted to negotiate and compromise, to find out means of arriving at an agreement, that in his first dealings with diplomats and even priests, he showed himself their equal, if not their master. Yet, if it had not been for his brothers, he would have had to win over every person in the government before attempting anything. The mere determination to bring about a coup d'etat, even with the support of the whole country, was not sufficient. The legal flaw had to be found by which to introduce it, the means be considered, allies discovered, the plan of action decided on, and the parts proportioned to the actors. But Napoleon was as new to civil matters as he had been 6 years before to military, when it was necessary to approach the assemblies, where his way seemed to have been smoothed for him by Lucien and his friends. He proved noisily intemperate and awkward, lost his head, spoke ill and diffusely, and accomplished nothing. Before the ancients in the Luxembourg, he surprised and alarmed his supporters. Before the 500 at St. Cloud, he would have been lost without Lucien, Murat, and Leclerc. He even endangered the plot, which had been so well laid. But fortune again befriended him. He succeeded by his very blunders in shifting the plot from a parliamentary to a military basis. Accordingly, as general, he played the first part instead of the second or third, or perhaps even that of the simple commander of the forces. Thenceforward, he was installed as one of the 3 provincial consuls in a vague, uncertain office, where he served his apprenticeship with keen observation, for he had much to learn, and where he consulted on affairs with Sieyès and Roger Dugas, under the observation of the commissioners appointed by the ancients and the 500 before their dissolution. But when he afterwards attained supreme power above this directory of 3 persons instead of 5, was it by the premeditated effort of an ambition which had marked out its end and was striving to achieve it by every possible means, or was it not rather by a combination of circumstances from which he certainly profited, but which carried him away, whether he was willing or not, and by the inevitable consequence of the measures which were occasioned by the continued renewal of the national powers of resistance? Everything in this affair was interconnected and dependent. The premises being such, the results were inevitable. The renunciation of authority, which is the bond of every civilized community, and the dissolution of the government, which exercised authority, produced anarchy. And in the same way, subordination resulted from the reestablishment of authority and its thorough application by the government. The members of the committees, which had been appointed by the councils to draw up the Constitution, were far from being all of them friends of Napoleon or the supporters of a centralized and authoritative government. There were only veteran revolutionaries to be found among them. Some were also who had been the most eager in the Constituent Assembly to destroy the central authority and to set up in every department district, and township. A parliamentary system such as would have frustrated all attempts at government and administration. Others, still jealous of such prerogatives as their predecessors had left to the head of the executive power, had made it impossible for him to exercise them either by bringing accusations against his ministers or by stirring up and excusing seditious outbreaks. Some of them had, in the convention, demanded and pronounced the penalty of death against the holder of the unified royal power, and had then assured their own tyranny by suppressing all lawful administration and by organizing despotic denunciatory committees. Finally, the greater part of them, although they had individually opposed certain members of the Directory more for their private than the public interests, had constantly struggled against any measure which seemed in the least reactionary or which might help to centralize the government to the profit of the executive and loss of legislative power. If they had sometimes allowed and even encouraged the quashing of elections of certain administrators who were disliked by the dictators and their replacement by certain tools of the Directory, it was never the efficiency of the administration that they had at heart, but their own likes, dislikes, and advantages. Thus, affairs in France had come to such a pass that the government could only be carried on by makeshifts. Bankruptcy was the base of its financial system, and it was enabled to secure for its citizens either freedom, safety, justice, property, industry, commerce, currency, education, or religion. In this utter disorder, each individual was obliged to rely on his own energy for his defense. The government would employ its tyrannical powers only against those who were believed to be its enemies. The branches of the administration were in the same state, each pulled differently, with the result that the country without money or credit, or the means of ensuring the recruiting of the army or of arresting deserters, was put into grievous danger by the first defeat inflicted upon them. On the 9th of Messidor of the year 7, the Directory declared to the consuls and the country in a solemn address that the body politic was threatened with total destruction unless it was immediately strengthened in every department of its organization and activity. For the moment, there was urgent need of establishing unity in the government and avoiding the barren discussions by which authority was lessened. It was necessary to set up a system of administration such as would allow the central government to exercise its power and would secure to the citizens the normal conditions of social existence. Therefore, those members of the committees who were upright and clear-headed patriots turned from the fantasies which they had followed too long, and by apparently entrusting the government to 3 consuls appointed for 10 years and indefinitely re-eligible, they set up in reality a ruler who was endowed with all the privileges of absolute power. For whenever the second and third consuls were summoned to a council, they possessed only a consultative voice in the government. They could inscribe their opinions on a special register, after which the decision of the first consul is final. The first consul proposed and proclaimed the laws that were elaborated by a council of state whose members were chosen by himself. He issued the standing orders necessary for their execution, controlled the revenue and expenditure of the state, saw to the police and the defense of the frontiers, negotiated every treaty, and appointed and dismissed members of the diplomatic, military, judicial, financial, and administrative bodies who, by reason of their offices, were responsible only to him. The representatives of the people kept their control over general affairs, but they could not interfere in the routine work of the government. The separation of the two powers protected the executive from that pressure which a minister brings to bear under a parliamentary government in order to bribe the electors. The duty of the executive was to govern. That of the legislative was to agree to taxes, inquire into the expenditure, and to decide on all cases of general procedure in which the country was concerned. This was to cause trouble later, but for the present all went well. The Senate was made made up of those men who had brought about the revolution, not only legislators, but generals, diplomats, men of letters, artists, and men of science, who overflowed into the tribunate and legislative body. Consuls, senators, tribunes, and legislators owed to their power to the committees appointed by the councils and were the outcome of the rule of the Directory only according to the Constitution of the year 8, as it was submitted to the people. Bonaparte was expressly put forward as first consul for a period of 10 years. He was accepted by 3,911,007 votes out of a poll of 3,912,569. The executive was founded on the unanimity of the nation. The legislative was founded not on a popular election, for it was a twice expurgated body, but on an arbitrary selection made by the surviving remnants of the last government. This disparity of origin gave a great advantage to the former power, an advantage which increased at every crisis. The men of the revolution, however, attained their end. They had not dared to appeal to the electors. The experience of the years 4 and 5 taught them that. Yet they were unable to start working a constitution without the nation's ratification. Accordingly, they put forward Bonaparte for election, and he put in force the constitution, thanks to which they kept their places and enjoyed a certain influence with the government. Moreover, they had no doubt that Bonaparte, the representative of the Republican army, and owing everything to the revolution, would, after playing a foremost part in the actions which had established it and assured its continuance, show himself, as in Vendemiaire and Fructidor, the stern adversary of royalism and the counter-revolution. Such was the situation on the day when the first consul left his provisional dwelling at the Luxembourg and made his entry into the Tuileries. It was on the 30th of Nivos in the year 8, January 20th, 1800. The little artillery captain had covered much ground in 6.5 years. What his real intentions were, none could say, for he was not self-communicative. He alone knew what his next action would be. His star had risen in the east. He saw and believed in it.